If you're here for the first time, welcome to Gnowbe. My name is Nicola Murphy. I'm the head of Microlearning Instructional Design, part of the commercial team here at Gnowbe. Been here a couple of years. This is one of my favorite things to talk about is how to actually make our content more engaging, more effective using content curation best practices. Today, we're looking at the subject of gamification. It's such an interesting one. We see the word around all over the place, but what does it actually mean and how do we actually incorporate it into our program content? We see the word engaging pop up a lot all over platforms, and it's really our heart is to be more engaging. I guess my question for you is why? Why is that such a buzzword right now? Any ideas?
Yeah. So, hi, I'm Ashish from India. I
Nice to
think
meet
that,
you.
hi, same here. So, most of the cases, when people say about engagement, I feel that trainers nowadays are more of verbose. They speak a lot. And then because of this speak a lot, they find that, okay, they have to speak a lot for training. So, training is all about knowledge transfer or information
Mhm.
transfer. But later on in their career or after some time, they realize that this verbose training or knowledge transfer is not helping them to engage learners. And that's why they are seeking how to engage learners, because learners nowadays have very less span of time, or learning retention is decreasing because of Instagram and reels and shorts and all these things. So we have to come up with new ideas to engage and keep their attention. I guess that's the reason why engagement or engaging things is increasing nowadays. Thank you.
Fantastic answer. If I can add on that little, and Nancy summed it up beautifully in a sentence in the chat there too. So definitely go and check that out. A question I commonly will ask when I jump on a webinar is, why are you in my webinar? Why are you in my masterclass? Why are you in my course? You find out this information on ChatGPT or Google. I'm exaggerating a little, but what's the why? Because that information piece is largely, it's already, that box is ticked, and yet we still tend to train that way. But if you look at the word actually train, it's actually to equip. And there's a difference between talking at, which is one way, and equipping for the purpose of you being able to not just retain that information, but know exactly what to do with it, to the point that you're actually able to equip somebody else that maybe doesn't know the information as well. So it's really interesting when we say engagement. Engagement is not one way anymore. It is two way. And that's a huge, huge difference when it comes to putting a content together. So if you had a chance to jump into the program, into the pre-session already, that's amazing. We're just going to jump into the board quickly just to see what people came up with. I'll just give you a reminder about what one of the questions was right at the end. And it was, can you share with us a game that you had as a child that you absolutely loved and tell us the reason why it engaged you so much? So I can see there's a couple of ideas up here. My one's actually not shared, but it is this little guy here. Can everybody see? So geeky as it may be, I'm so sorry, judge away. It's this game called Boggle. I loved this game so much as a kid because the Boggle works this way. You shake it, it has a combination of letters. You have a little timer on the side, which is about 60 seconds. And your job is to form as many words as you possibly can within the constraints of that time. Why was it such a great game for me? One, I could do it by myself, or I had the option of doing it with somebody else. So there's that student agency or learner agency, or the way you think about. Two, it was time bound. So there was an element of competition, whether I was by myself or with somebody else. Three, it had variety to it. The numbers the letters were different each time. So there was that idea of scarcity as well. That was just very, very compelling to me all the way. And also there was intrinsic benefits. I upskilled in my ability to read and write and comprehension just because I would form new words. Why the hang does that matter, Nicola? It's a game. Because gamification is not just about getting the points and being competitive and having coins or badges or getting certificates. It's so much deeper than that. And if we could take the principles of those games that we perhaps had as a child or adulthood as well, I hope we still play, then they can be super relevant to non-gamified elements like the learner experience in tackling this big area that we're probably all on here for. How do I solve the issue of learner engagement? So Brian, I'm sorry, I'm just going to pass the ball to you. What's a childhood game that you played that was super engaging and why?
Probably most of you aren't old enough to remember, but there was a handheld game that was the football game, and it had, for the players, it was little lines. It looked like hash marks, and you just moved up and down. It was one directional. It was super simple. There was a little bit of sound, but I think it was kind of the same thing about what you said was engaging. I could pick it up and do it quickly. So when I had 2 minutes or 10 minutes, I could do it. I felt like I was achieving something. So I got a touchdown or whatever. So there were points associated with it. So it leveled me up, and I just kept growing with it. And it was super simple, and there was no educational benefit whatsoever, but loved it.
That's amazing. Can I have one more person share? What was the game and why? What were I guess, the principles that you could take from it that, like, oh, that's actually why I still loved it more than just playing it once or twice? Adriana, what was yours? I'm curious.
There's two Adrianas, me or?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Hold on, I'm putting my camera.
No problem. Hello. Good to see you.
Hi. Well, so we used to play tons of games outside in the neighborhood. There were tons of kids, but we also had lots of video games afternoons. And the one that I absolutely loved was Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine from Sega Genesis. It was like a Tetris game, but you could throw things to the opponent. So it's basically a Tetris one versus the other one, and you can, yeah, very, very fun. And I was the best one in my neighborhood.
So there was a competitive element to it. There was
Yeah.
a social element to it as well, which is really important when we think about the learner experience, right? There's so many things we can consume online in terms of content, but it's way more motivating where there's other people going through doing it as well. And time bound, huge, so good. I'm sure we could probably spend the hour just talking about this, but we won't. We will move on. So if you're on session 2 with me, we are looking at action 2 within session 2. Okay, if I can just orientate us a little bit over here. We're in Let's Get Started, and the action that we are in is this one here. Okay, what makes some games great, and why is it important that I'm orientating you? Because then you get to actually participate. There are some questions that will actually allow you to put your own responses in and share them to a group board, so we can all see them at the same time. And so I've just kind of amalgamated some of the data that I found and in terms of what actually makes some games great and others actually not so great, because it's flipping the same coin around the other way. We're probably all familiar, maybe not, but I was definitely the Candy Crush saga that kind of went on. It was absolutely huge and engaging. I felt like it overran every academic classroom that you ever saw because of the use of color, which I guess was, kind of new because it was all less colorful and they looked very delicious. The little pieces that moved around, there was a steady progression of challenges. It wasn't, sometimes we can make our content too accessible and I know all of this stuff already. It's not challenging, therefore I'm instantly disengaged. Sometimes it's like Monopoly and we give them all of the sets of instructions all up front, all at once. It's very long, complicated, and it's actually too challenging. So finding that sweet spot and easing people into the learning becomes really valuable, right? Minecraft, this is definitely a favorite that circulated. And why was it so engaging? It was fast paced. It was open ended. It inspired creativity. There were still points attached to it, but there was a lot of exploration and what I call learner agency involved. I'm just going to flip down here because there's lots of different words, but you can just kind of see that they tended to be more game based. There's simple rules, varying difficult levels of challenge, and then kind of clue giving or Easter egg hunts throughout. By comparison, when you flip it and look at the games that were boring, take a look at the list. This is just the kind of the top 8 to 10 that research suggests were perceived as the most boring. What words stick out to you here as being interesting? Looking at the red. And then again, apply this to content curation because it becomes important, right? I think this is interesting. And I catch this so often when I'm talking to clients is the lack of, there's just not great outcomes. You need to have really solid, specific outcomes. If a game is confusing, you're not kind of sure what the end goal is, you're kind of driving around, circling around, and there's no end goal. And I'm not motivated to continue on. This one here, all the decision making being made for me. I think that's really interesting. If we think about that in the light of content, sometimes we treat our learners like they're a little bit silly, and we kind of like, this is what you must know, and this is why it's important. If you forget everything else, this is the thing. Versus actually make it more kind of learner centric, flipping the decision making on them and going out of this option and this option. What would you choose? Why? and kind of prompting it that way. So they're in the driver's seat and we're actually not. What else do you see in there that strikes you as interesting? How do you know that your program might be confusing for someone to understand? This is an interesting one, because I was talking to somebody recently this last week. So often we're like, I understand my content, I understand the questions that I've written, therefore that will translate to everybody. The problem is, especially with online content, we don't actually know how it's received unless we do something like a pilot test, unless we actually, I think we have a Microlearning Instructional Design accreditation program. One of the, a couple of people in here will know, that would have experienced this. They had to actually take their third program that they curated and actually teach it to a group, although either online or in person. Why? Because you get to iron out the kinks, the things that are confusing, the things that don't make sense as you go through. So it's very interesting, kind of just seeing the crossovers between gamification principles and actually applying it to the learner experience. And if I can get it a little bit more geeky, can everybody see this beautiful table? I hope so, because it would be so sad. It would be a waste if you couldn't see it. You can see here, I've just kind of put the differences between, I guess, characteristics of games. I've split them into digital games and board games. So you can kind of just see some links here. Games that were engaging and addictive versus games that were actually disengaging and boring. You can kind of see on the left-hand side here, it just throws something out that you can see that you're like, oh, that's interesting. Never thought of that before. You can feel free to unmute. What do you see that's like, oh, that strikes me as super interesting. I never thought about that when it comes to content curation.
May I share?
Yes,
So it really, I was writing it here and sharing it to the group, but I think that I'll just unmute it. But the part of the bugs that it's mentioned, the numerous bugs, and how I hadn't thought of it for content creation, and what you're explaining about the confusing aspect of the storyline. So would that be a way of understanding bugs in learning scenarios, as in those moments where you lose the learner along the way? Would that be?
That's really good. Losing the learner along the way. So obviously the flip side of that is anticipating where they're going to get roadblocked, and that's going to make for a better experience. But I love that you're leading them through an experience. You don't have the not necessarily online with them at the time. So anticipating where they're going to get stuck, what doesn't make sense, what questions they're going to have so that you can answer them. When I'm training leaders in teaching skills, I always say, never give them a practical application that you haven't actually walked through tangibly yourself. So maybe it's a role play exercise, or maybe it's even a reflective question or something that you're wanting them to do. You actually have to do it for yourself first. I know it's time consuming, but you actually anticipate where they're going to get stuck better. So the experience is actually better when they go through it by themselves. So great notice. Anyone else? Looking at the left-hand side here, clear goals, clear rewards, balanced difficulty progression. I think this is interesting. Quite often within training particularly, we can kind of throw everything at the beginning at them. It's actually too difficult. Classically, my background was education originally. In a school year, we would never give them information that they didn't know right at the start of a program. We would never give them all of the monopoly set of instructions. And this is why this is important, and how this counter moves here. And then you get this, and you get this, and you get this. It was all information, and it just went over their heads. The first 5 weeks of a classroom year were dedicated to establishing prior knowledge, building connection between everybody in a space, so that there was rapport developed between teacher and students, between students and students, which I find really, really fascinating when we're thinking about progression of difficulty. Simple information, known information, through to more complex, difficult, and tangible is actually a better progression. And then when you're thinking about the participatory aspect as well, make sure you're easing them into the learning. It's not crazy amounts of high focus. Don't shove them into a deeply reflective question at the beginning of a program, for instance. Maybe have something like a poll or a multiple choice, very, very low stakes kind of a way to start out your program content. And you can see here the word strategic was lining up with what Adriana was talking about. If you go onto the flip side here, can you identify, let's be honest with ourselves, myself too, is there anything in this long list of things that you're like, oh, I've actually fallen into this trap in the context of content curation before? Take a moment. Can you identify one?
Hi, this is Adriana, the other Adriana.
Yes. Hello, good to see you.
Hello. What you were just talking about, for me, it's the lack of giving an aha moment of why it couldn't be reached, rather than, like you said, the repetitive and monotonous tasks. It's not showing me why I couldn't achieve it. So it's just telling me you didn't achieve it, you didn't achieve it. Some of the best games, especially online games, is you have to figure out that little key, and it makes you want to look for that key. So I think it's a lot of the stuff for games that sometimes I've created is, yeah, the learner just gets stuck and doesn't know how to get out of it.
Fantastic. So good. If we're looking at assessment, for instance, there's a right or wrong answer doesn't tell me what part of it was wrong. Like a good job doesn't tell me what I did well and what I didn't do well and what's my next step to improve. I want to take it further than you nailed it. Oh, you didn't, right? Because we'll get this in a second, but there's different motivators in terms of gamification and learner behavior. And some of this is covered in that, some of it's not. I'll get there in a minute. One other person. Justin, do you want to take a stab? What's something in that list that you're like, oh, I've fallen into that trap before? Oh, that's okay. Maybe you can't hear me. I think this is interesting. Oh, we'll go for it, Brian. Yeah.
I'm going to do the antithesis of the last one, simple mechanics. I can make things very complex. I can have 5 learning objectives for a simple Gnowbe program, and I will have that large aha, like you could write your dissertation off of that in the very first action. So I think I lose people because it's so complex. And then when I go back to re-edit it, then I do it kind of the opposite of where now it's that simplistic. And it caught my attention with was it Candy Cane game?
Oh,
where
yeah.
It's more block. So I kind of go from too complex all the way to making it easier to where it's just luck. And so I lose them on both sides. And yes, that's probably more often than I'd like to admit to this group, but it does happen.
Interesting. How do you counteract that? I'm curious what learnings, because it is a common trap for all of us.
So I really have to rely on those external focus groups, pilot groups, going out to customer discovery. I found that I can't balance too simple or too complex. And so I have to rely on the customer. That's the only way I survive.
Really, really good. So which is fantastic, because I think that's another key point, right? The reason that games were actually invented, do you know why? Like, why do people actually invest time creating games in the first place? It's a lot of money for a simple game, right? It was actually the recognition that people get bored, the recognition that people need a way to actually connect to each other. They need a way to be able to break the ice with people that they don't know and learn more about each other. And what the connection that Brian is making is, in order to create content effectively, that's not just all of this information that's crammed at you when we already have information available to us, is I actually have to know my audience. I would say my learner, because audience implies that they're already passive. So I switch that mentality to you're a learner, and I'm going to cause you to learn at all costs. If the more that I know about them, the more I'm able to actually hone in those learning objectives down to the what I call the essence. It goes from all the context and all of this stuff to the essence that's actually, I guess, what we call the must know, versus those fluffy nice to knows. They're nice stories. They're really, really great add-ons, but do they actually drive towards where I want them to get by the time they're done with me in the amount of time that I've got with them, right? So we could spend, again, a lot of time on this as well, but it gets you thinking, oh, these are really interesting elements. We're looking at board games, we're looking at digital games here, but there's so many applications that cross over to the learner experience. So you can definitely spend a lot of time looking through those and probably have more that I haven't actually added to the list. So let me just take a moment to bust a couple of myths. When I heard the word gamification, my instinct was probably similar to yours. this was me. I was like, oh, it's points, it's coins, it's badges, it's like tokenistic things. They definitely can work, but that's not what gamification is limited to. You can see here, if you, sometimes you run into this, people like, I've got serious content to be launching out to government agencies. I'm not going to put gamification in there. That's just cheesy stuff. It's for kids. You don't put games in there. We talk about policies. We're talking about safety. We're talking about child protection, all kinds of things. I'm going to bust the myth on that a little bit. It's the gamification principles that we're actually looking at. And maybe we don't actually understand particularly what they are. So I'm going to dive into that a little bit. Some people think that gamification is expensive and complex to implement, but maybe it's because of a lack of understanding of what gamification is. And we talked about this a little bit, but it's taking those game-like principles and putting them into non-game context. It's not just the superficial rewards. And so it's kind of interesting. I know some of you might be familiar with Gnowbe, some of you might not be, but the system that we've actually developed is there's this guy called Yukai who developed this. I think it's called I can't pronounce the name of it. What is it called? It's a particular framework called I think it's the Autolus framework, which basically he looked at our platform, which was super interesting. And he was like, you guys actually get gamification. Some people get it at a surface level and they've got the coins and the tokens and the badges. And that's not wrong because it definitely hits a demographic of people that are really, really competitive. But not all of our learners, in terms of the way that they are engaged, it's not necessarily about competition. There are different kinds of learners who are like, I am very, very social, and that's what I'm motivated by. I am driven by achievement, and that's why I jump in. There's relatability, context, personal development. There's so many different reasons or motivators for people who are actually learning, and understanding those becomes really important, right? Now, there's a lot of words on here, but I just want to throw a couple of numbers at you because it's really interesting, right? Just in the light of, does it actually work? Does this thing called gamification that we're talking about actually works? Check this out. I thought this was super interesting when I found this one. So there was a study in 2010 that showed that by implementing gamification elements into corporate training programs led to, did you see this? A 50% increase in learner engagement, and this increase in terms of completion rates. Isn't that wild? Just by adding gamification elements in there. That's huge. Looking at another study here, 14% higher skill-based knowledge just by adding gamification elements in there. 11% higher factual knowledge. I could go on and on and on, but it's very, very interesting to just kind of see. Well, here's some, practical examples. We're probably all familiar with this one, the Duolingo. That's the language learning app. I think Spanish is the common one that I hear in the parts of the world that I'm in. But isn't that wild? A study found that 34 hours of this Duolingo study equated to a full semester of language courses, and people were so motivated to do it that they would get through that really, really fast. SAP, 37%. This is interesting too, particularly with if you're looking at the next generation of learners up and coming, like we would call them our Gen Zs. Voluntary participation is not something that comes naturally to them, is what the research suggests, because they're more interested in figuring out the solutions at the top and eradicating voluntary stuff. But I thought it was really, really interesting that they actually saw a 37% increase in voluntary participation of program content. Largely, huge completion rates on programs come from content that is compulsory to complete, but this was just through gamification and voluntary completion. They actually saw a 37% increase. Cool, eh? So I guess it works. So I'm curious. This is me finding out what you know about gamification. It's a cheeky question, but what gamifications or strategies have you tried to integrate into your course content already to drive learner engagement? And you can either choose to write them into the program here and share them to the group board, but I also want to open it up so I can type down the answers that we come up with collaboratively. There's something about seeing your ideas come to life on a page that just, it's a little bit of a gamification aspect. I want to collaborate. I want to join in. I'm motivated socially, so let's do this. What are some gamification strategies that you've tried already? Any ideas?
Say that I've tried incorporating creative activities, whether that might be find a song that relates to how you feel about this, or create a drawing, create a collage, somehow bringing that creative aspect in to it sort of feels more playful and not as heavy.
I love that. It's also it's stretching the brain in a different way, because we're so used to being told to listen to something, write something, or read something. I wrote practical twice. I must have meant it. This is what I meant. Yeah, very, very good, Nancy. Thank you. Any other ones, team?
Yeah, this is Aaron. I've used Jeopardy with the key points that we were trying to learn as categories. That's been fun. I've also used magic to help teach specific principles.
And your aim is it engagement? Is it retention? Like what's the
Jeopardy is engagement, because it's competitive and people want to earn points, and
yep.
And then magic is just retention of something fun they see and relates to the specific topic. So it's more
That's
just
good.
retention.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I mean, a Kahoot is another one, isn't it? We've used that. We quite often will have something like that within our within our Gnowbe all hands programs. Sometimes it's a fun way of making sure that we understand the values of Gnowbe, make sure we know the organization. We need that refresher, but it's a fun way to do it that makes it feel like you're not learning, so you're kind of tricked into learning. It's a really, really great way of actually establishing like prior knowledge or something like that. What other ones? I'm curious, what else do you use? You probably use it all the time, is the point I'm trying to make. We're not aware that it's classified as gamification. Yep, got those ones. Ranking, rating, quizzes, absolutely. Certificates, actually just having them in a program, or at the end, like, hey, you get something as a result of completing something might be an example. The element of surprise, having something kind of pop up that's unexpected, to jolt to somebody. I often use this, and Brian will be familiar with this term, a hook at the beginning of a program. Well, when our learners come in, if you think about a conference, they're used to just being a bum on a seat and just listening. That's what we're used to. We're listening to one speaker up the front. They might have their PowerPoint, and we're just sitting there. We're largely disengaged. It's the same online as well. We come in expecting that I'm just going to click, click, click. If I've got some stuff to read, don't actually have to engage with it. So having some sort of a hook which engages curiosity or piques intrigue or is challenging is a really, really great way to start off a piece of content. I'll leave the floor open for one more response from somebody. Gamification, what do you use?
This is Adriana again.
Yeah.
Adriana Walker. The hook that we use, especially because a lot of the training we do are folks who come in and it's required that they have to do it. So our hook is try to throw in a little humor, get that absurd answer. Like, here's the situation of communication at work. Okay, Mary's answer is, we're going to plot so-and-so's demise. And she just use humor because it shakes them out of the, oh gosh, I'm here, I have to do this. So just go to the wild side just for a minute to make everybody laugh.
I love that. It's so, so true. Really good. It's so fun. You get to learn from each other. And it's amazing how much just gamification, it stretches us outside of the known boxes into the out of the box ideas, which is really fun. Nobody's really great for playing around with that stuff. Okay, which leads me to this, and it was kind of interesting. It was interesting to see some of the first responses, which tended to be more of those extrinsic motivators versus intrinsic. Can someone give me a definition of the two? What's the difference?
Hello, it's me, Justin. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Sorry,
Hey, Justin.
I am learning on my commute to work this morning.
Oh, that's
so I heard you call me
amazing.
earlier. Couldn't get to the phone, but I can give you a quick rundown of intrinsic versus extrinsic.
Yeah.
Intrinsic, the motivation just comes from the learner. Naturally, they want to do it. They want to actively participate. And extrinsic means there's some kind of external motivation, like money or coins or badges, you know, like the LMS systems oftentimes. So that's my quick rundown on intrinsic versus extrinsic.
In the car on the way to work. I'm impressed. Very good. And I love catching what you said there with the extrinsic. That is what a lot of our LMSs catch, and that's why we hear the coins and the badges and the points, right? But it's quite interesting. Maybe, you know, others have probably got something to speak into this as well. But if I could take my teaching background for a second, and it does apply, let me just say, if you can teach a 5-year-old, you can teach a 60-year-old. I don't know why it works. It just, sometimes you got to dumb down that content. If you can, it's just a piece of quick content curation feedback I have. Sometimes our programs are so complex. The best advice I ever had was go to the children's section, find a book on that subject, really, really simplified, and then build on from it. Sometimes we can be so complex, we miss our audience completely, and they're having to grab the dictionaries. Anyway, I digress. When I was doing, it was for a thesis, I was looking at the issue of behavior management, and we're looking at the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. Extrinsic was the equivalent of gold stars. Sit up on the mat and I'll give you a gold star. Be quiet as a class, I'll give you a gold star. It's going to be the coins that add up in the jar, so the class gets a big prize at the end of the year, all of those kinds of things. Do you know what I ended up finding as I was researching this stuff? This actually motivated students less and less over time, and it was more and more work for me to implement. How do we apply that to the online space? If you're giving them an extrinsic reward, like, hey, you get a gift voucher or you get a day off from work, like they're not wrong things, and they can be incredibly motivating for a subset of our audience. The problem is it's a lot of work for you to actually implement and follow up on, and all of those gaps. And actually the learning, if you look at the metrics, the level of retention, the level of application was actually less than what it was if you took all of those things away. So I had all of these extrinsic motivators in my class. I had the points, the number charts, the gold stickers, every student's name. And I tried this multiple times. And then the following year was like, oh, I'm just going to scratch it. And I'm going to go for the intrinsic. And it was student driven, and it was, okay, I'm here, but I want to be here, and I've established it in collaboration with you. And there was so much more motivating across the board. I found that my learners were more focused. They were more motivated to complete. They weren't comparing themselves against somebody else, which was amazing. For my high achievers, meant that they weren't just kind of free flowing it because they're like, I know everything anyway, I can just cruise. Everybody had their own subset of goals, and actually the motivation, the engagement increased just by focusing on intrinsic. So I've done a bit of waffling there, but isn't that wild? I find that largely very, very interesting if we're thinking about online platforms. So if we're looking at intrinsic motivators, what the hang are they? Now I've got here, you can do this as a bit of an exercise. I won't spend time on it now. Maybe you've done it already. Just as a bit of a sorting exercise. This is an example, actually, of a subtle piece of gamification here. Oh, and I gave away the answer, right? Is this task a form of gamification? Maybe you can write down the bottom why it is. But the option here was to sort these into which ones are extrinsic and which ones are intrinsic. Yell at me for a second. Which one is this?
Extrinsic.
Extrinsic.
Nice. This one?
Intrinsic.
Why? So mean.
Because of the format, that it's the way that they engage.
Yep. And it's like learner driven, right? Okay, this one?
Intrinsic.
Okay. This one? Intrinsic, because they're the ones who are looking for the clues throughout. I always think about the Pixar movies when they put the little character for the next movie in the current movie. Such a great example. Those are super fun to embed, and they're like the cliffhangers or the teasers that are between, you know, one piece of learning content and the next, and maybe they try and figure out the answer before you reveal what it is. They're super great to use. Last one.
Extrinsic.
Extrinsic, yep, absolutely. It's that kind of leaderboard kind of mentality. It works definitely for our competitive ones, but maybe for not others who are motivated, you know, in a different kind of way, being self-driven. So they're fun to copy and paste and throw in the right categories. But we'll move on to the next piece here. The point that I'm trying to make is we want to make sure that we're moving beyond badges, points, and actually getting to outcomes, you know, using gamification. It's not just about the I'm waving a shiny gold coin. It's the, oh, I'm actually achieving the thing, the outcome that would, Brian and I were talking about earlier. I'm motivated because at the beginning I didn't know this, and now I do, and I know what to do with it. That's a sweet spot of gamification. So here, this is what our Gnowbe team uses when it comes to gamification in terms of principles, largely focusing on best practice. We did so much research out there to see what our learners were motivated by. And it came down to these kind of 4 categories that we're looking at. The first one being context, right? So if I'm being asked to play a game of Monopoly, which is probably a terrible example, I want to know why. I think Adriana mentioned that before. Why in the first place? How is this going to benefit me? Why is it fun? Why is it engaging? What am I going to get from it? Am I going to get more connected with the people around me? Am I going to become more equipped with the content to be able to do my job effectively? I need to be able to give that context. The next principle is curiosity, right? We talked about this a little bit, but curiosity is like handing somebody instead of offering them the gold that we've dug up already and we're just handing it to them for free. I want to hand them a shovel or a spade and tell them, coach them in how to dig up that gold for themselves, that they actually own it. Curiosity is a huge factor of engagement. Challenge. If it's really, really easy and accessible for me and I've done all the work for them, it's not motivating, right? Have you ever had an experience where you just sit there and they go, here's everything that you need to know and here's why, versus what would you do if, and then you give them a scenario and they've got to figure it out. There's something very motivating about them. And consequence, we're going to be looking about this here. Thinking about how games actually use rewards, punishments to nudge players towards a desired behavior. And that could be a positive or a negative, but both work really well. So moving on to the next piece here. The first principle being context. Can you think of a game that, sorry, no, I lie, not a game. Can you think why context might be important in terms of a gamification? Can you think of an example to actually help develop context when you're creating content? Is probably a better way to word it. So I've given you a couple of tips to get you started here. Giving learners a clear sense of purpose early on by sharing the bigger picture behind the learning, kind of where your learning sits, and then making them feel like they're actually a part of something that's bigger than themselves, right? I'm curious, what's an example that you can think of that would help to develop context? I would often use something like that, imagine if or what if, as a starting point. What about you guys? Maybe it looks like sharing an example. I mean, so when I went through Teachers College back in New Zealand, here's a great example. We sat in front of a panel right at the beginning before we did any of the content learning, and we listened to a story of one successful student who had gotten herself a teaching position right at the end of Teachers College. But have a success story of, oh, this is what I can attain to, and I set that right at the start. 1, they know what they're supposed to achieve. 2, they know what they're supposed to learn. And 3, they've got an example or a model to kind of follow after. That might be an example of context. I know where we're headed because it's given to me right up front. And it's in a video format, maybe, and not just text. Any other ideas? I mean, obviously, this is one, right? A learning outcome. Making sure that we actually state what that is at the top in some way, shape, or form. Does that make sense? Giving people time to write there. Okay, let's move on to number 2.
Yes.
Number 2, curiosity. This is a really, really fun one, right? And I've given a few examples already, so I'm going to open it up. Megan, can you think of an example of curiosity, an element that you could incorporate into a program that develops curiosity?
Ooh.
You could embellish or expand on one of these 3 if you're kind of getting stuck on your own.
I kind of similar to a hook type idea. I kind of like the idea of giving them something, at the beginning, and then them not knowing what, this is the opposite of context, right? Not giving the full context of what it is. And so then they're kind of curious, like, okay, but what was this about? And then it makes me want to know. I'm like, okay, I'm trying to look for the connection point in what you're saying, because I know there's going to be one. And that me, my intrinsic type of style is I want to figure it out before anyone else, before you tell me. I want to be able to figure it out, because that to me is a challenge, right? So if you give me something at the beginning, but have it fully explained to me, I'm going to spend the entire time looking for the connection point, and I will remember it, forever, because that whole entire time I was just searching for it.
So good. It's like a really, really great movie. They put you right in the action. They've got the main character who, if it's a really, really great storytelling, you can actually identify yourself in the life of the main person, the main lead, right at the start. But they also have them running away from a scene and they're freaked out, they're crying, and you automatically you're going through the problem solving. Is it this? Is it this? But they're running away from this person. They've got this expression which tells me this. We fill in gaps with story because that's how we're wired. It's a really, really great way of starting off a program. Great example. And not giving it away all at the start. Super important. If I'm going to outline, I saw some examples of this in the last couple of weeks in program content. Don't give away what's in every single session, every single component of your course right at the top, because there's no mystery in that. You've done all the work for me, and I might as well just read it all on the front page. So enough that it keeps them interested, but not too little. So that's great. Asking them a teaser question, making them guess what's going to come next. Yep, really great example there. Okay, the what's inside the box kind of idea is a really great one. If there's a Christmas present, I want to know what's inside. I don't want to hear what you're talking about. I'm trying to figure out what's in there. That kind of element at the beginning of a program is very, very so good. We will move on. Scenarios are really great too, for you to kind of pop in there. Challenge. This is an interesting, especially with an online program. How do you incorporate challenge right at the beginning? If you know your audience, here's what I would say. If you know your audience, you can be a little bit more daring with this one, but don't not have it. AKA, I wouldn't ask my learners to do an in-depth assessment, 10 out of 10 before you move on to the next action. If I'm just meeting you for the first time, if we were 3 or 4 sessions in, I definitely could do this as a bit of a knowledge check, because the intrigue of challenge, I only got 5 out of 10. There's actually knowledge gaps that I have. I want to go back and learn them. It could be a fun way to start. Thought-provoking questions. I often say, sometimes if you've got half an hour's worth of talking or worth of content, sometimes more can be achieved by just crafting a well thought out question. That there could be more, it could create more learner depth and retention and understanding, invoking their own ability to problem solve, find the answers, collaborate with each other, be able to find the answer, than giving them half an hour of content. So that's a great example. What are some other ones that you can think of? Examples to help integrate challenges. I've done this one before where I will say, hey, I'll put a timer on a couple of minutes. I'm just looking at this one here using timed assessments. And this was like an example of prior knowledge that I used. And I said, you've got this image and I like you to draw, I want you to write a piece of writing 2 minutes flat there we go. You've got 2 minutes to write your best piece of writing. It has to be your absolute best. And then you're going to share it after this 2 minutes. The reality is they never had to share it, but I was more interested to know the thought processes that were going off in their head while they were writing stuff. It's a great example of challenge because I put parameters on it. 1, it was time bound, and 2, it had to be their best work, and 3, they were going to share it with an audience afterwards. Hugely challenging and motivating at the same time. Anyone else? What challenges could you integrate as a factor of gamification that are kind of like in the sweet spot, not too much, not too little?
I like the idea of a question. You have that on there, but just a question that makes the learner, me as a learner, if you ask me a question near the beginning that sometimes I come into a training and I'm like, okay, I don't care about this training. I'm just checking the box here. To be completely honest with you, I'm here, I have to be here. But if there's a question at the beginning of the training and I read it and I'm like, oh crap, I don't really know that. maybe I do need this training. Maybe I do want to pay attention, because that question I feel like I should know and I don't. It doesn't have to be the most complicated question in the world, but just something that is a little bit of something that hits that intrinsic part of me that goes, okay, that's an interesting thought. I didn't have that, so maybe I am going to learn something here, and then I'm more likely to take on the challenge of A, listening to you, and B, learning from the program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so good. It's awesome. All right, let's move on. Oh, go for it, Brian.
Oh, I was just going to say, I put in the chat before, I tied in your question of why are you here at a course recently? And it was an in-person course, and we talked about it. And part of it was they came back with, we want to learn to collaborate. We want to learn about how learners, asking learners, we had all these great suggestions. And then they did a challenge of, I had a bunch of balloons. And I said, stack the balloons as high as you can. I put in a time limit that they had 4 minutes. You had to pick groups, and gave them all of that. And they built them, and nobody ever asked questions like, could we put them against the wall? Could we do this? And so we use it as an example of, you get projects that are time bound, you panic, all those lessons that you learned about collaboration, asking questions, working together, all went out the door because you had this time limit. And so it kind of sets the whole course of, now when we are discussing things, hopefully it gets them over that, I'm just checking the box of why I have to be here. Now they're kind of looking and saying, oh, there are some very simple lessons we have to learn and practice. So that was a good challenge, at least in a physical class.
So good. You can still implement those things by having timers. Obviously, it's more reliant on somebody, to be honest, when they're actually doing it, but kind of setting it up well. But keeping it's amazing what just putting a timer on would do for somebody, and giving parameters around what to fill out, what not to. It's awesome. Great example. For the second time, we'll move on to this very last principle, and it's consequence. I think this is probably the one that we're probably most familiar in terms of things like leaderboards, assessment. You either passed or you failed. Are there any other kinds of consequences that you can think of that might actually boost engagement? We've got, the example of, I guess this is more kind of extrinsic. They are important for a certain demographic within our learners. So how would you how could you set up reward mechanisms, offer incentives to motivate your learners towards particular goals? There's one little function in Gnowbe that I actually really liked for this. It's like just the copy user answer, where it's like, what do you know at the beginning? What do you know at the end? That's an example of motivating somebody towards a goal. Well, I knew this. Oh, I actually know this at the end. Now that's awesome. Oh, I got 5 out of 10 out of these questions. Now I've got 10 out of 10, right? That's an example. Got a little chat in here. Yeah, tell me about that, Andrea, the pop-up messages.
So after activities, after certain, so those pop-up messages can either reinforce answers or let you know that you've reached up to a certain point along the course, or so they're very versatile. I feel that for challenges, they can, for consequences, they can help about orienting the learner where they are within the module. And yeah,
it's really good. I mean, it might look like, hey, if you got 5 out of 10, then here's your next step, and I want you to complete this action, write this thing, this many words. If you scored 10 out of 10, then here's the thing. So the consequence might look like, oh, it's a slightly larger work task than do you know what I mean? There's so many different ways you could go about this, and in a really creative way that pushes people to go and do something practical outside of a platform. It's not just, clicking through passively on the phones. This might be a sidebar, but it's kind of interesting just to add to the conversation. I'm involved in a lot of conferences, and these conferences didn't actually tend to do surveys before to find out what people actually expected or wanted from the conference. I finally did it this time. It was about lots and lots of responses. I ran them all through ChatGPT to find out what the common patterns were and what the common percentages were. And about 42% of them said they were coming to these conferences because they wanted to be practically equipped. They wanted to be equipped, and they wanted practical application, which I find very, very fascinating when it comes to building online experiences, making sure that we're incorporating these elements that we're talking about of gamification, Largely, you're going to see this more and more coming through, that our audiences are not looking for the information. They're looking for the opportunity to put something on its feet, to wrestle through, not just from here's the information to I want the opportunity to be able to evaluate it, reflect on it, rub up against other people's perspectives and weigh up pros and cons, similarities, differences. Those are the pieces that they need access to. And those are the pieces that AI is just not going to be able to help us with, that evaluative synthesis kind of piece and practical applications. So have that in the back of your mind when you're building out your program content. Because it's coming very, very front and center. And you'll find that that's why a lot of institutions now, I don't know if you're finding this, Brian, but in conversations I'm having, university numbers are dropping off across the board. It's schools, universities, anything that's kind of lecture focused. And actually there's more numbers who are starting to boost up in those trades kind of schools instead, because they want the hands-on stuff and they want the face-to-face interaction. They want to be able to collaborate with their peers online in an online environment where there's, lots of LMSs that don't necessarily have that ability. So very interesting to keep front and center. For the sake of time, this is a fun takeaway for you guys to go and practice or play with here. This is an example of practical application where I've got 3 different scenarios. So I'm thinking about learner agency, right? I'm giving you choice. So that is an element of gamification. It's incentivizing because one, you get to choose your experience a little bit, but the idea is to choose one of these scenarios, and then the challenges, or let's just take an example, for instance, customer training service situation. Customer training representatives undergo a training program that is heavily lecture-based, this is exactly what we're talking about, right? With little interaction or practical application. This leads to disengagement or application of customer service skills on the job. And then the challenge is, what gamification methods would you use to make the customer service training more interactive and ensure better skill development and application? That's one example. What I would love just after this call is if you can take a moment to fill that out, share it to the group, which you can see down here. If I just give you an example of what that looks like, and you'll see other people's answers pop up on the board. Here's an example of that group board with everybody's responses, right? Why it's really, really great to learn from each other. We're all in different industries with different use cases, and sharing those learnings makes us better, well-rounded at what we do. Any questions? And would love to do a bit of a follow-up call. We love connecting with organizations and continuing to learn and grow from each other. In and around the area of gamification, what you guys are using, learning, that'd be fantastic. I'm curious, before we finally wrap off, is what's one thing that you've taken away from today that you're like, oh, that's new, I'm going to take that?
I think I have a whole new understanding of gamification, and that is way beyond leaderboards and I've just taken so many notes and thinking about how to incorporate all these things.
Oh, that's wonderful, Nancy. Thank you. Great feedback. Wonderful to have the rest of you on. We will see you in another masterclass soon. Sorry, did I miss somebody's question?
No, I just learned that why some games may fail just because of the basic principles that you're introducing, why they might fail.
Isn't it wild? I know, and I feel like I scratched the surface, because you literally could just spend so much time just appropriating the differences and the pros and cons and what makes in a game engaging. But it's so much more than just the extrinsic motivators. And actually those are less motivating, which is such a big wake-up call for many of us. So good to have you guys on us. And I don't know if you know this, but Brian is one of our speakers at the Create conference. So see their face? You might see him again soon. Very excited to have you on board. All right, team, have a wonderful day. If you've got any follow-up questions, feel free to email me. I'm happy to jump on a call, and let's keep learning. We'll talk soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.